I remember how she wept as she stroked her pregnant belly when I unearthed during one of our many trips to the garbage dump to hunt for food what I thought was a turkey for a Christmas dinner. The package turned out to be a black child aborted by its mother. While growing up in apartheid South Africa, I almost died, and so people died, including my friends, in the 4 decades that I've lived in America. I've never been more worried about our nation's future. To defeat the slouching, rough beast of tyranny of legalized racial oppression under which I was born and grown for 18 years. I see that same despotism being replicated across America. Patriots of all races must unite and ensure the American dream never dies. Earlier this year, I spoke to students at Savannah Country Day and Bethesda Academy about the importance of education and freedom. While in Savannah, a city whose role in a civil war which almost destroyed the Republic is legendary, I met kindred spirits at a soiree who were passionate about using education to ennoble and empower lives and to preserve individual liberty and the American dream for posterity. They included Stephen Blackwood, president of Ralston College, Jordan Peterson, its chancellor, and his wife Tammy. The next day, while touring the historic city with a group, bathed in salubrious sunny weather, Tammy and I became absorbed in a deeply spiritual conversation about mothers, which led her to read my memoir, Kaffir Boy. On the eve of the 4th of July, Stephen informed me that Tammy had finished the book. This was my response. It shows how a mother's undying love for Christ, her husband, and her children during the apartheid era helped save my life by inspiring me to turn obstacles into opportunities and hate into empathy, which led to the miracle of my escaping from bondage to freedom by pursuing the American dream. It also shows why Lincoln's last best hope of earth must never be denied or allowed to die. How propitious for Tammy to reach out on the eve of the 4th of July, a day that's very special to me. My celebration involves more than fireworks and barbecues. Enjoyable as these certainly are, especially when shared with family and friends. My festival includes reminding myself of why America's birthday is one of a kind. Having finished reading Kaffir Boy, Tammy will understand my reasons for responding to a short email with the following encomium. Edmund Burke set the precedent with his famous reply to a letter from a French nobleman soliciting his thoughts on the historic events of 1789. I hardly presume that this is another Reflections. But there are too many people in today's America who are masquerading as defenders of democracy, justice, and humanity when they are actually the heirs of Marat, Robespierre, and Danton, who, in the name of liberty, fraternity, and equality, instituted a reign of terror. And what is cancel culture but a modern guillotine? Thus, a poor imitation of Burke is urgently called for. First of all, July 4th like Bastille Day, which it inspired, always reminds me that freedom is not just another word. It's the very essence of what it means to be a human being, to think for oneself, to act according to the dictates of one's conscience, principles, and reason, and to assume responsibility for the consequences of such acts in the shaping of one's destiny. That's why Milton wrote the following in Areopagitica, a title he derived from a hill in Greece where St. Paul gave one of his most famous sermons. Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties. It's why I chose Milton's exhortation and those by Frederick Douglass and Percy Bysshe Shelley as epigraphs for Kaffir Boy. I wanted to remind readers that while growing up in apartheid South Africa, I almost died, and saw people die, including my friends, for only dreaming of the freedoms most Americans take for granted. Chief among these is freedom of speech, the bulwark of democracy, without which the entire magnificent edifice, with its checks and balances for buttresses, crumbles. Thus the imperative need on this hallowed day to also reflect on the existential threat facing America in the aftermath of the riots of 2020, the abrogation of personal liberties, and the miseducation and traumas inflicted on a generation of students during draconian COVID lockdowns, the breakdown of law and order in many cities, the censorship by social media platforms, the use of race to divide Americans, and the pouring into the country of millions of illegal immigrants. As an immigrant myself, far am I from being xenophobic. I embrace all who come to our shores, enticed by the American dream, as I was. But they must do so legally, as my family and countless others did. No nation, despite its vast wealth and potent weapons, can survive without secure borders to prevent deadly drugs like fentanyl from decimating its youth. In the 4 decades that I've lived in America, I've never been more worried about our nation's future or seen more evidence of William Butler Yeats's prophetic warning of what will happen when things fall apart, because the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. To defeat the slouching rough beast of tyranny, now wreaking havoc with the sacred foundations of democracy and civilized society, patriots of all races must unite and ensure the American dream never dies. To quote Thomas Paine, an immigrant who was also a dauntless patriot, "These are the times that try men's souls." The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. The glorious triumph of the American dream first inspired me while I was trapped 8,000 miles away in Alexandra, a Johannesburg ghetto created by apartheid, a tyranny of legalized racial oppression under which I was born and groaned for 18 years. Tragically, I see that same despotism being replicated across America under the banner of identity politics, which says that our differences are more important than our shared values as Americans and as human beings. In South Africa, the creators of apartheid used identity politics to divide people into 4 groups: white, black, Asian, and colored, and teach a white supremacist version of critical race theory in segregated schools. They insisted that race was more important than character and merit, and should be used to carry out affirmative action as a form of reparations for the sins of the Boer War, during which the British imprisoned Afrikaner women and children in concentration camps. 28,000 of them died from malnutrition, dysentery, typhoid, and measles. Such payback transformed my hometown into a festering 1 square mile concentration camp, in which more than 200,000 people were kennelled in shacks without running water or electricity, drowned in a miasma of poverty, hunger, and violence, and subjected to brutal police raids, during which my father, the sole breadwinner, was marched naked out of bed, interrogated in front of his terrified children, and arrested for the crime of living with his family. Yes, living with his family was a crime. Whenever I wallowed in self-pity and victimhood, and even cursed the day I was born, my mother would say, "We are still a family. God will not forsake us. And you may be trapped in hell, but you still have choices that can save your life and give you and your siblings a better future." Though illiterate, my mother became my best teacher. Her life exemplified the values taught by Plutarch, Christ, Hypatia, Spinoza, John Donne, Sojourner Truth, Chief Seattle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Socrates. These values are enshrined in our founding documents and have been appealed to by generations of American freedom fighters, including Douglass, the suffragettes, and Dr. King, to galvanize we the people to create a more perfect union. Each time the appeal was made, the blank check was honored at the Bank of Justice. My mother told me that God would honor my check requesting a better future if I made the requisite tough choices. Thus she urged me to emulate role models of character, honor, and heroism rather than gang members and criminals. To believe in the invincible power of love, to be unafraid to think for myself, to value education, to have empathy, to refuse to drink the poison of hate and expect it to kill my enemies, and, which was so hard to do, to forgive my father for his gambling, alcoholism, and abuse, as he was being emasculated by apartheid's Kafkaesque laws. Deep down, he's a loving man, my mother said. That's why he refuses to abandon his family. And someday he'll examine his life and find God. My mother believed that the kingdom of God was inside each of us and that no one was beyond redemption. And she was prescient about my father. After Kaffir Boy was published, I received a letter from my sister with the miraculous news that my father had stopped drinking, gambling, and being abusive. By the time I brought him to America, shortly before he passed away, to experience the dream I had doggedly pursued despite his opposition, he had become a deacon in my mother's church. Like Job, my father had cursed God. He even accused God of being a racist who only cared about white people. My mother countered that to God all lives mattered, including those of the unborn. I remember how she wept as she stroked her pregnant belly when I unearthed, during one of our many trips to the garbage dump to hunt for food, what I thought was a turkey for a Christmas dinner after being hungry for days because my father was in jail. The package turned out to be a black child, aborted by its mother so she could keep her job as a maid. While trapped in a ghetto, believing in a God who loved black folks was a Herculean labor. Like my father, I came to curse God. I did so because for most black people, life resembled Goya's black paintings and Hobbes's Leviathan, rather than the Shangri-La and Elysian fields of white folks. I saw children die from hunger, gangs disembowel people for a pittance, and I had friends who prostituted themselves for morsels of food. The only thing which kept me going was my mother's unwavering conviction that someday, somehow, I'd realize the American dream if I never gave up its quest. This was easier said than done. My life hung in the balance after I defied a murderous gang to stay in school. I was often accused of trying to be white because I excelled academically and strove to learn English, my sixth language. And I was vilified, called a race traitor, and even escaped death for befriending white people, who gave me books I could not afford, jobs to help feed my siblings, and a tennis racket which became my passport to freedom in America. I never would have made it to the promised land had I been afraid to stand alone, and had I betrayed my conscience, which told me that I should avoid premarital sex as a teenager, despite being called vile names, and that education was important and should be pursued with discipline, determination, and perseverance because, as Malcolm X said, knowledge is power, and without education you are not going anywhere in this world. My conscience also told me that whites were not all racists, that I had to judge them as individuals and give each the benefit of the doubt, just as I expected the same, and to view them as potential friends rather than certain enemies because of past experiences with racist cops. Mastering the courage to make such tough choices is the only way to avoid what Etienne de la Boétie described as voluntary servitude, giving your power over to others so they could use it to run your life, define the terms of your humanity, prescribe the limits of your aspirations, and ultimately determine your destiny. July 4th always takes me back to when I first realized I possessed this power and why I should never give it up, even when my life was at stake. It was when I read, for the first time, the Declaration of Independence's mesmerizing preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The document, which I obtained clandestinely from the American consulate, was banned in black schools designed by apartheid to teach us servitude. I soon understood why. Reading the Declaration over and over again, surreptitiously, under a flickering candle, in a shack where as a child I had slept on pieces of cardboard with newspapers for blankets. Reading the Declaration created a revolution in my thinking and being. As if by alchemy, it imbued me with a freedom I thought was impossible to possess in bondage. This freedom is best captured by Richard Lovelace's poem To Althea from Prison. My Althea was a book. I discovered that books could transport me in an instant to any country, any century, any culture, any civilization, and even to the realm of mythology, to commune with the greatest minds who'd ever lived, make them my best friends, and they are treasures of the true and the beautiful in life, the nourishment and adornments of my unconquerable soul. Frederick Douglass was right when he said that once you learn to read, you'll be free forever. That's why I almost died saving books. Classics which included Shakespeare, from a library that had been set ablaze by rioters whose rage reminded me of Sankolut's mobs in 1789. Shakespeare became my favorite writer after I was called retarded for being unable to read Elizabethan English by a spoiled brat for whose family my grandmother worked as a gardener. I could have withered into a victim from his insult. Instead, I took it as a challenge to master English. Books gave me a power more dangerous than the guns and bombs I desperately sought in the aftermath of the 1976 Soweto student rebellion, after my girlfriend was shot by the police while we were protesting against being indoctrinated into servitude. And her parents, her grieving parents, were made to pay for the bullets which had murdered their loved one before they could retrieve the corpse for burial. This Promethean power bestowed by books, which liberated me from the chains of what Bob Marley calls mental slavery, is what René Descartes meant when he said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Tragically and inexplicably, this is a power which, in today's Orwellian America, I see people giving up, only to be gaslighted and sold big lies by politicians, elites, bureaucrats, and media apparatchiks on COVID, natural immunity, the meaning of freedom, democracy, and what constitutes an insurrection, and a woman. Why not, as a citizen of the freest country in the world, fearlessly defend your convictions and principles and values and shape your own destiny, instead of censoring your thoughts, doubting your instincts, dutifully obeying the thought Gestapo, and parroting the shibboleths popular with echo chambers and amen corners on social media platforms, which dehumanize and persecute those who think for themselves and refuse to become the Eloi of a brave new America, where riots are called peaceful and lawbreakers are sanctified as martyrs and heroes. I then understood why Orwell wrote Politics and the English Language, and why he said that during times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. The 4th of July also reminds me of why Lincoln said that we are all born as originals, but most people choose to die as copies. After my girlfriend was killed, I wanted to become something I was not. A killer who, goaded by revenge, embraced mob violence and repudiated the values at the core of my being, and which I had learned the hard way. But my mother told me that the sweetest revenge would be to vindicate those values by proving apartheid's claim of black inferiority a lie, and to expose its inhumanity to the world. I could only do this, she said, by resuming my quest for the American dream. She reminded me of how much I admired Arthur Ashe for the weapons he'd chosen to fight with. Ashe was literally the first free black man I'd ever set my eyes upon when he came to play in a tournament in 1973. What most struck me about him were not his superlative skills as a tennis player. Those were obvious. What astonished me was his audacity to think for himself and to express his thoughts, no matter how radical, without fear or apology to anyone, including black militants who called him an Uncle Tom, and white people who called him uppity. Under apartheid, my dad, who was almost twice as his age, couldn't even look a white boy half my age in the eye, but had to grovel and shuffle and call him master. This was the ultimate emasculation of traditional black men like my father, whose self-respect was based on their ability to exemplify responsible manhood to their sons. The creators of apartheid knew this and had devised strategies for emasculating black men and destroying the black family that would have made Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and Talleyrand envious. This was hardly surprising. Hendrik Verwoerd, the chief architect of apartheid, who also designed black education, had studied eugenics in Germany during Hitler's rise to power and based his critical race theories on Nazi ideology, just as CRT in America is based on an ideology which emasculates black men and then blames racism for the problems afflicting the inner cities. When all rational people know that no community can thrive when most of its children are raised without fathers and trapped in failing public schools. Visiting such schools across the country and the prisons to which they often lead, I understood what genocide and national suicide meant, and how the mighty Roman Empire was conquered by the Goths after being weakened by rampant licentiousness which undermined family, faith, morality, and patriotism. I also understood why Ash had such a profound impact on me when we met. I remember asking myself what had empowered him, a descendant of slaves, to escape from the clutches of Jim Crow, apartheid's twin brother, earn respect, and ascend the pinnacle of success on and off the tennis court. From reading about his life, mostly in books from white friends, I discovered that Ash had succeeded because he grew up in a family which taught him the values of hard work, faith, responsibility, and belief in the American dream. He had also developed a lifelong love of books after his mother taught him to read at age 4, and his father was a strict disciplinarian who insisted on excellence in school and sports. Discovering this empowering reality through books made me understand what Milton meant when he described a good book as the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. Books enabled me to also understand why John Stuart Mills wrote On Liberty, an essay which gave me compelling reasons why free speech is the citadel of democracy, and On the Subjection of Women, a book which taught me to understand why my mother sacrificed so much to enroll me in school after she was denied the opportunity to attend because she was a girl, and compelled by poverty to marry at 16 a man almost twice her age. She wanted to ensure that her 6 girls avoided her fate, which they did when I brought them all to America to go to school. It took 15 years for all of them to legally come over. They're now successful adults with families of their own. The 4th of July also reminds me of the importance of having 2 parents. Heroic as my mother was, I never could have survived the horrors of apartheid without my dad. He was the disciplinarian, and even his mistakes served as important warnings. This led me to wonder how, without a viable nuclear family structure, fatherless young men can avoid getting their values from their peers. Gangs, debasing rap songs and TV shows, and alienating social media. I remember how when my father was in jail for the crime of living with his family, my mother would gather us around the brazier, and while staring at empty pots, would ask us about our day and tell stories which taught us values and reassured us that things would get better because tomorrow was another day. She also took us to church, whose members, despite their own poverty and struggles, helped her with rent and school fees whenever my father was in jail. Upon his return, he always resumed hunting for jobs, even when apartheid's Kafkaesque laws made it almost impossible for him to be employed by requiring that he have a permit proving he could look for work. But to get that permit, he needed to already have a job. When I brought him over to experience the American dream, he marveled at all the freedoms, especially the freedom to work. But he then wondered why so many people, white and black, didn't want to work when there were so many jobs around. Why do they have families and children then? He asked me. His question made me recall the young men and women of my generation, including my girlfriend, who were killed fighting for a future where they could enjoy half as many freedoms as Americans were blessed with, where they could work hard to fulfill their dreams, build families, and raise children. After my girlfriend was murdered, I fell into a funk. She'd been my inspiration to excel in school and to pursue the American dream despite the odds. I remember constantly playing Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen, my favorite band, after my uncle gave me a radio cassette player for being the top student 3 years in a row. Then pandemonium broke out. After the government shut down black schools across the country because of rioting, gangs forced young men to join them in burning alive people accused of collaborating with the enemy. Students were arrested by the secret police in midnight raids, detained without trial and tortured. Thousands of students who could have been W.E. Du Bois's talented 10th, pillars of communities and the country's pride, ended up glutting graves. Others fled the country to be trained as killers, not of wild beasts, but of fellow human beings whose sin was having a white skin, which reminded me of the haunting line in Wilfred Owen's poem, Strange Meeting. You are the enemy I killed, my friend. I survived Dante's Inferno by making the Declaration of Independence and the books my North Star. They revived my determination to reach America. They gave me the courage to risk my life by making secret trips to the white world to practice tennis with white friends in the hope that they'd help me win a tennis scholarship. These were the same whites I would have earlier killed without remorse, but reciprocal empathy made us trusted friends. These friendships kept me alive during 2 nightmarish years of unremitting riots and inhumanity. Most importantly, they facilitated my admission to a tennis tournament in 1977, where I met Wimbledon champion Stan Smith. Stan and his wife, Margie, who were friends with Ash and his wife, Jeannie, helped me finally achieve my American dream by arranging a scholarship to a college in South Carolina. I never would have achieved the American dream if my mother hadn't convinced me to replace hate with empathy, and if I hadn't read about how Dr. King and Frederick Douglass had accomplished their missions by enlisting white friends and allies. I was deeply moved when I read about Douglass's meeting with Lincoln at a White House reception following the president's second inaugural address. Lincoln asked him, "I saw you in the crowd today, listening to my inaugural address. How did you like it?" "Mr. Lincoln," Douglas answered, "that was a sacred effort. Only in America could a former slave be friends with the president. The same America, despite the legacy of slavery, would later elect as its president not once but twice Barack Obama, the son of an African father and a white mother, after he, like Lincoln, appealed to our better angels by exhorting us to unite, because there is not a Black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. Those four groups must become one, because in South Africa, when they were divided, apartheid was created. Yet this is the same United States of America the disciples of identity politics insist is incorrigibly racist and must be ruled by cancel culture. But to paraphrase Douglas, the limits of tyrants of the mind are prescribed by the endurance and pusillanimity of those whom they oppress. We, the American people, we must summon up the courage of a Patrick Henry, who cried, "Give me liberty or give me death." The courage of the patriots who mend the ramparts of freedom at Valley Forge in the dead of a bitter winter. The patriots who marched as vilified suffragettes. The patriots who stormed the beaches of Normandy to defeat Nazism. And the patriots who braved water hoses, tear gas, and dogs to defeat Jim Crow. The last thing we must do is to betray their hallowed memory when they handed us such a glorious heritage. Worse, the worst thing we can do is to stand idly by and watch their statues torn down by those who ignore or don't understand history and human nature. Churchill warned that those who sit in judgment of the past will lose the future. If we let that happen to America from fear of cancel culture, future generations will curse our memory. They will react like Charlton Heston did when, wandering along a desolate shore, he stumbled upon a ruined Statue of Liberty, and it slowly dawned on him that the planet of the apes was actually home, was America. It wasn't a distant alien planet, it was America. We had reverted back to barbarism instead of using the past to trace, as Voltaire urged us to do, the steps by which humanity had emerged into civilization and might even achieve a Saturnian golden age if we but learned from history instead of relitigating its crimes and follies. Langston Hughes, the marvelous poet of the Harlem Renaissance, warned us about what happens when a dream is deferred. We must not let the disciples, merchants, and mercenaries of hate divide us, nor must we let them rob our children of their innocence by teaching them to hate each other and their country. Not when the long-deferred dream of a colorblind America is within our grasp. The evidence is before our very own eyes. In election after election, from Virginia to Texas to California, voters of color and young people have begun thinking for themselves as citizens rather than victims. This is leading many to escape from the democratic plantation, which is gaslighting us about Jim Crow 2.0 and its insults that blacks and Latinos who think for themselves and vote for candidates who affirm their values, principles, and conscience are traitors to their race. These Americans are searching for a home where their humanity won't be poisoned with identity politics, where people are judged by the contents of their character and deeds, and where reciprocal empathy and respect, not pity and blame, reigns. They know that America is not perfect and that racism still exists, but they also know that this is the only country where, more often than not, anyone, regardless of color or religion or creed, anyone who works hard can achieve any dream. My mother's exhortation that I believe this with all my heart and soul, despite the daily nightmare of life under apartheid, is what led me to eventually achieve an impossible dream. That's my decision to celebrate the 4th of July with this panegyric. Burke may have set the precedent, but I also remember what Demosthenes and Cicero did at a time of great peril for the freedom and independence of their respective republics. I believe that freedom is the breath of every human soul. America gave me this priceless gift at no cost, except my gratitude and willingness to defend with the best weapons at my disposal the Republic when besieged by foes of freedom of speech, the citadel of democracy, and the mighty sword of a pen and an emphatic voice are my chosen and best weapons. To quote Joseph Conrad, a favorite writer whose misunderstood novella, Heart of Darkness, is a damning indictment of colonialism and Europe's version of identity politics, which condoned slavery, gave us Hitler's Nuremberg laws, and created Jim Crow and apartheid. Conrad said, "Give me the right word and the right accent, and I will move the world." Heart of Darkness reminds us that no one is beyond evil. Thus the symbolism of Kurtz going to Africa, spurred by a missionary zeal, only to end up, after tasting mercenary power, declaring, "Exterminate all the brutes." The founding fathers were flawed men. Some owned slaves and were even racist. Yet despite all that, they possessed the wisdom and foresight to leave posterity a blueprint for expiating the nation's original sin and living up to our motto, E pluribus unum, from many one. Thus the imperative need to fearlessly speak out against those who deny the redemptive value of our founding documents. Her Churchill, who's also been called a racist, who should be cancelled. Had Churchill not inspired the British when they virtually stood alone against Hitler's blitzkrieg? The Man in the High Castle wouldn't be a TV series, but America's reality. It's clear that many fear losing their jobs if they speak out against those who are undermining our founding documents and teaching children to hate each other and America. This fear is understandable, but it is also dangerously myopic. There were plenty of jobs for those who went along with Hitler's hate, Stalin's purges, and Mao's cultural revolution. People should also remember the haunting warning at the entrance to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It's by Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran pastor in the Third Reich. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Speaking out is the best form of self-protection. My mother believed, like Socrates, that no evil can befall a good person. She constantly reminded me that my unmerited suffering would not be in vain, as Viktor Frankl elucidated in Man's Search for Meaning and Dostoevsky in his novels. This belief led my mother to experience what the God-intoxicated Spinoza calls blessedness, that inner joy and peace experienced by the soul amid the storms of life as we view things sub specie eternitatis, in the light of eternity, as Spinoza put it. Witnessing my mother saying yea to life, despite being denied jobs, arrested for blacks-only crimes, and beaten by my dad, inspired me not to be cowed by death threats in the pursuit of the American dream. It made me understand Shakespeare's warning that cowards die many times before their deaths. Nelson Mandela, who in 1941 rented a room several blocks from the shack where I was born, also drew strength from Shakespeare's warning while imprisoned, like Dickens' Dr. Manette, on Robben Island, the Bastille of South Africa. And in a powerful speech less than 24 hours before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King defiantly told his audience that he was fearless of death because his eyes had already seen the promised land. We still haven't achieved the colorblind meritocracy for which he and other patriots gave their lives, but generations have since tasted many of its blessings. Integrated schools and neighborhoods, equal justice and access to jobs, the right to vote and run for office, freedom of speech, assembly, and movement. The list goes on. Those who've lived under tyrannies know how priceless these blessings are. And had I allowed fear of death to stop me from pursuing the American dream, my mother would never have seen the promised land and rejoiced when her 3 grandchildren vindicated her sacrifices, faith, and love by graduating from Princeton University. This was a poignant moment for my mother. Her grandchildren had been her biggest cheerleaders when, at the young age of 60, she eagerly enrolled in a literacy class at the local church so she could finally learn to read her favorite book, the Bible. The day she graduated brought tears to my eyes. She revealed that her dream as a child was to be a teacher. Now I understood why she never gave up on me. I also understood why, like the Egyptian philosopher and scholar Hypatia, who, for urging people to think for themselves, even if wrong, was accused of witchcraft by enforcers of Christian orthodoxy. I understood why my mother was accused of the same by some of our neighbors. They wondered how, when she was illiterate and poor, I was able to excel in school, avoid being killed during the riots, as so many of my friends were, and achieve the impossible dream of escaping to America and giving the family a better future. But what they called voodoo was my mother's undying love for Christ, for her husband, for her children, and for education. In the end, what made my mother most proud was that my wife and I had raised our 3 children who are biracial to cultivate friends of all colors and taught them to love education and America and to identify as members of the only race which ultimately matters in the annals of history, the human one. This is why Independence Day is very special to me, and more than just about barbecues and parades. And defending it with the power of the pen and a voice that shall not be silenced. Defending it and the American dream and our shared humanity as citizens of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, defending it against the poisons of identity politics and critical race theory, is a hill I am prepared to proudly die on. Edmund Burke warned that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to stand by and do nothing. Thank you and happy 4th.